I see.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to take a second or so to let everyone connect and log in. Then we'll get started. Okay. So good afternoon, task force members. I'm Jess Leinhart, director of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus. And I am going to start off by turning things over to Illinois Senator Laura Ellman, who is the chair of the caucus, to say hello and get us started. So over to you, Senator Ellman.
Thank you, Jess. Hello, everybody. This is Laura Ellman. Welcome to today's Task Force on Climate Resiliency presentation. I'm particularly excited. Well, I guess I'm always excited about the topics at hand. But this one, I think, is something that kind of takes us almost full circle from our first inaugural meeting to today when we're talking about flood resiliency. And our first meeting in Detroit, we actually visited some areas that were hit by floods. So really excited to be listening today. So before we get started, I'd like to invite task force members to unmute themselves and introduce themselves. So please, Jess, if you want to help facilitate, or task force members, take it away.
Well, and I see in the chat, or I think just to me, so Senator Karen Housley is here from Minnesota, but she said she's not going to be able to speak, but she's going to be listening. And then Laura, do you want to say hello? Laura Tamaka.
Hi, all. Laura Tamaka, Director of the CSG Midwest Office. Thanks for joining us for this call and pleased to see everybody.
Okay. And then over to you, Manel, if you would like to say hello.
Yes, hello. I'm Director of Partnership and Development in Intersectoral Flood of Quebec. So we are here to represent universities of Quebec and Canada working on flood zone and resiliency.
Great, glad to have you here. And then Charles, I know you and Manel are both from BRIS, but if you'd like to say hello.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm happy to be here. I'm same network than Manel. I'm going to try it too, Manel. Intersectorial network flood, no, flood, you know, the intersectorial of Quebec network. Yeah, that's something like that. Nice to see you, everybody.
Nice to have you here. And then Byron or Jenna, if either of you, and I see Lauren Young, if anyone wants to come on camera and say hello, I'll give that opportunity. Oh, I see Byron.
Hello there. My name is Byron Steele. I'm on staff with Commissioner Namika Brown of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. And this is my first time attending one of these meetings. So I'm just an observer, taking notes and seeing what great work you people are doing.
Well, we're glad to have you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And then Jenna, go ahead.
Hi, I am Jenna Voss. I'm Program Manager for Clean Water and Equity with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. I am also, this is the first time I'm joining one of these presentations. I'm excited to hear it, and I'm just observing. Thank you.
Wonderful. And then Rosemary from Ontario, do you want to say hello or?
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, I'm from Ontario, the Secretariat of Ontario. I'm here with FPP French. I don't see her logged on yet, but as soon as she will, I'll give you a signal, Jess.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And then Lauren Young.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I work with MWRD Commissioner Daniel Pogozelski's office and also first time attending and just here to observe.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining. And then I do see a 216 number on the phone. If you'd like to come off mute and say hello. Maybe they're unable. I know that sometimes it's tricky on the phone. So then back to you, Senator Elman, to continue us through the agenda.
All right. Well, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Hughes. Sarah Hughes, she goes by she, her, is an associate professor at the University of Michigan and a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Her recent research focuses on the political and institutional dimensions of equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water management, and resilience, and improving urban flooding response and preparedness, including equitable approaches to building climate resilience. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, NOAA, and the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Hughes's research has been published in Nature Climate Change, Policy Studies Journal, and Environmental Justice, along with other journals in political science, urban studies, and environmental policies, and even a journal dedicated to the Great Lakes, which I can't recall the name of, but I stumbled upon it as I was going through Dr. Hughes' formidable list of publications. Which gives me a chance to mention a couple of the books that she's authored. One of them is from 2019, Repowering Cities, Governing Climate Change Mitigation in New York City, Los Angeles, and Toronto, from Cornell University Press, as well as 2018's Climate Change in Cities, Innovation and Multi-Level Governance, from Springer Press. And I'm just going to mention one more news item from August, and I think just this is what captured our attention. In August, she was a co-author of some commentary that included new guiding principles for urgently needed Great Lakes stewardship from Dr. Hughes and other University of Michigan colleagues. So that was on our radar, and I think that's what brought Dr. Hughes here. She's also contributed to national and international scientific assessments, including UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook for Cities, the U.S. Global Change Research Program's Second State of the Carbon Cycle Report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 Assessment Report, and the U.S. National Climate Assessment. Hughes has previously held appointments at the University of Toronto, the U.S. EPA, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And hello, Dr. Hughes. Welcome. I really look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's lovely. And I'm really excited to be here today. To me, in a lot of ways, this is kind of the pinnacle experience to have the opportunity to talk to decision makers and to share this work. So I really appreciate the opportunity very much. I did prepare some slides to help share some of these ideas. And I'm going to talk about a project we did, I'd say over the course of maybe 2021 to 2023, I'd say is when we were doing this work. And it involved a couple of really great U of M graduate students as well from the School for Environment and Sustainability. And I'm really excited that it's out in the world now and to be sharing some of what we found. I want to give just a little bit of context and background to where the project came from. I started at the University of Michigan in 2019, and I'm originally from Michigan, and I was coming back I'd been coming from the University of Toronto to the University of Michigan and really trying to dig into the Great Lakes context and the challenges facing the Great Lakes as a region, and trying to understand some of the changes that the region has been undergoing and that is kind of ahead, kind of coming in the future as well. This is an image I like to use. It's actually changes in night lights between 2012 and 2016, so we can kind of see where some of the shifts are. We've got new lights appearing in the blue. We've got lights disappearing in the orange. We know we've got kind of demographic shifts happening in our region, increasing urbanization in many cases, but also population decline in others. So we know we've got these demographic shifts as part of our broader context. We also know that we've got climate change happening and continuing to happen as well, and is something that the region's doing in many cases a great job of tackling, but is just sort of part of the context of doing this work, where we know we've got increasing vulnerability to various kinds of disasters and climate risks, whether it's floods, storms, fires in the north, heat waves and droughts. I really like this image on the top here. This is an image that GLLC put together that kind of shows how Michigan's climate will change in the future. And it's actually kind of making the kind of analogous comparison to different states, so that the idea is kind of by end of century, under lower emission scenarios, our climate might look something like Missouri's or Arkansas's. So it's kind of I think that's an interesting and helpful way to sort of be thinking about these things. We know we're also going to see changes in precipitation, right? Which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, where overall we're expecting to experience more precipitation in the region, higher volumes under shorter time periods as well. And all of this has serious implications for service delivery and infrastructure that our communities depend on. Like a lot of places, we've got infrastructure that's in need of some upgrades, in need of additional investment. And I think of climate change as an additional stressor on that pre-existing need, whether it's our drinking water systems, our energy infrastructure, right, storm and flood mitigation infrastructure. We know it affects transportation networks, our roads and bridges, and also heating and cooling needs in our homes and businesses. The third piece for me that I think about is also the fact that we know that we're fairly unequal region as well. Again, these are issues that almost every city in the US is having to grapple with, this legacy of segregation, of income inequality. But we have a sort of special concentration, I think, of these inequalities and these segregation issues in our Great Lakes cities. There's different ways of kind of slicing and dicing that. We've got 15 of the 25 most segregated cities in the US in the region. And across the board, what this table is trying to show, this is from another study we did on local flood mitigation policies. But almost across the board, we've got these income gaps between white and minority populations, typically our Black communities, where we're seeing these household income gaps in our communities. So I think of this as, again, kind of the broader context, and it plays out when we talk about things like managing flood risk, because what it means is that we have disparities both in who is exposed and kind of vulnerable to the changes we're going to see with climate change, and disparities in the ability of communities and households to adapt to these changes. So again, I put these maps in. This is from a different project where we looked at these intersections between race and income, flood risk, and the darker colors, the kind of darker blue colors in these maps of Chicago and Buffalo, show where we see those intersections of, in this case, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and what's the word? Kind of elevated risk to flood. And we see places where those intersections are most prominent. So again, all that just to set the stage a little bit for where where this project originated from. So I'd been doing a lot of work at the local level, thinking about how cities come at these questions, how we transform our communities and our infrastructure to respond to these dual and intersecting challenges. We've been doing work to develop resources for local decision makers. We're doing policy analysis, case studies, and arriving at the idea, a couple of ideas. I guess one is that the big idea anyway is that taking on these challenges, adapting our cities to climate change, doing it in a way that not only, doesn't make our inequalities worse, but maybe even helps to address them, really requires like this whole of city approach. It really requires a systemic, intersectoral approach to the problem. And it requires a lot of resources too, whether it's data or funding or just staff. And there was that's kind of where I was at when we were starting this project was, okay, we've got this need, we have the vision might be a stretch, the vision is maybe a little abstract still at this point where we want to go. But how do we get there? Like what really might be some of the next steps for helping our cities get there? And that's why we ended up focusing on state level, because I'm not a person, I haven't done a lot at the state level. I've been working more at the local level. But it became clear actually in a few projects simultaneously that states really, and this is not going to be any surprise to this audience, but that states really have a big role to play in providing those resources, helping to generate that capacity. And I think also to play a role in kind of leveling the playing field between communities as well. We know that doing this kind of work is a lot easier in some places and a lot easier for some communities than for others. I think that's a place that the state can play a role too, is kind of leveling that playing field a bit between communities that have a lot of resources and communities that don't. Anyway, so all to say that I had a moment anyway of really having a new appreciation for how important state policy and planning can be for the kinds of changes we want to see in our cities. So what did we do then? We got some funding from GLLC, which was great, which is the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences Assessment. It's a NOAA cooperative center based in Ann Arbor. There's maybe a half dozen of these around the US, but we got some funding to look and see what states are doing in the Great Lakes. What kinds of policy and planning do states have in place, and how might we assess these? It's one thing to kind of, it's its own challenge sometimes to point to what states are doing. There's so much, it's so intersectoral. But then is there any way we could say something systematically about where we can identify great progress, great examples, and kind of bring those out as findings. So the first thing we did in this goal of kind of wanting to score state policies and programs and do this in a way that was systematic and comparable, the first thing we did is sort of try to characterize the scope, the space that we wanted to be working in. What is it that states can do to support communities in this way? What are the different kinds of things we should be looking for? And here we leaned pretty heavily on this report, how state governments can help communities invest in climate resilience. Very apt title. But they had done a lot of this work of identifying these 4 categories of things that states can do. And those are provide information, provide planning guidance, provide regulations and standards, kind of more, rules and requirements, and provide funding and financing. So that seemed like a good place to us to start. Okay, so these are the kinds of things states can do. Let's go out and see what they're doing in each of these spaces. The other thing we wanted to do, this is again very iterative. Once we started looking at it, we realized, okay, there's some things happening in these spaces that states are required to do. And we wanted to be able to distinguish between things states were doing because they're required to, and things that they're doing that we might say are above and beyond those requirements. Like, are there places where additional investment is being made, where additional resources are being given? Because otherwise we could just look and see what the requirements are, and that's what states do. So we wanted to see, okay, is there something more than just these requirements that's going on? So once we were able to do that, we assigned scores to each state in each category between 0 and 3. So for each state, you could get between a 0 and 3 for information provision. You could get between a 0 and a 3 for planning, regulations, and so on. So for each category, you could get a 0, 1, 2, or 3. So the total score for each state could range from 0 to 12. And again, it doesn't, a 0 in this case doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing happening. It means we didn't see a lot that was beyond what's required. All right, then the last piece is we really wanted to highlight places where attention was being given to equity and justice. And we had originally had this as a category, but we thought, no, I think this is something more that cuts across each of these 4 categories. So within each of these, there's ways you could kind of design these efforts that prioritize equity and justice. And then we give stars if you're doing that. All right, so then we did a whole bunch of data collection. Again, a great team of students did the scoring, and this is what we came up with. These were the results we came up with, and what made sense to us. So in each of these cases, so for each state, you know, you can see we've got colors assigned to each of those 4 categories, and the length of the bar, right, the sort of size of each color corresponds to the score you got on that category. And then the stars indicate, right, like I said, whether we saw attention to justice and equity within those categories. And so we thought this was a good way of getting a picture of where things are at and where we might look to as good examples too for states that might be leading, and sometimes I think leading in ways we wouldn't always expect because we had this broader suite of categories we were using as well. So let me give just some examples of some of the things that got good scores. So Minnesota got very good scores on planning guidance, and it was because we found all these examples of ways the state was doing planning and providing planning guidance that was relevant to flood risk. So they had climate action framework, a water plan, a hazard mitigation plan. They'd established this climate change sub-cabinet. And they also got an equity star, we called it. They got an equity star in this category too, because within most of this work, there was attention to disparate vulnerabilities, the needs of disadvantaged communities, representation on the sub-cabinet, and this kind of thing. So we gave them a 3 with an equity star too. Another example, and these are older policies actually, but ones that we thought were still like quite innovative. And in New York, this was a state, we saw New York as a state that was, I'd say particularly ahead on the regulation side, the kinds of rules they have, especially around receiving state funding. So they've got the 2014 Community Risk and Resilience Act, where climate risks have to be part of planning, permitting, and funding processes in order to access state funds. And similarly, the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act requires this demonstrated consideration of future flood risk. So in both cases, it's the state kind of building in consideration of future climate risk in order to, you know, as part of participating in a program or receiving funding for a program. The third example I'll give, I was trying to find ones that were kind of coming from different categories. The third one is Pennsylvania's climate impact assessment. So this is information provision under the information provision category, where kind of providing for communities, like here's where the risks are, right? Here's where the climate impact risks are, and you know, in a way that cities might not have to redo it for themselves. And if you see, this was the process they went through in doing that. And so we also gave them an equity star because in this very first step in setting the context, they considered climate justice and equity as part of their kind of social vulnerability assessment. So, you know, there's lots of takeaways, I think. The ones we highlight in the report and in the larger paper as well, I'll just sort of flag here too. So one is that I think there's ways we can do more in these within each of these categories to center equity and justice. And there's some examples of this, but probably still some innovating to do around these things. I think that, to me, one of the low-hanging fruits potentially is this idea of providing information and examples as a way to create momentum across communities. So I think this is something that cities are often asking for, and that I think I think it's kind of a low-hanging fruit for state governments potentially, is to be this information and example provider. It doesn't require, you know, regulatory changes. It doesn't require a big pot of money, but I think can be pretty valuable. And I think just generally this third point around incentivizing and supporting desired actions, I think a lot of times, because some of this is really new, and I think because flooding is really cross-cutting across departments, there's often not a single agency with authority over this kind of issue. I think it still feels a little bit new sometimes. And so I think even the idea that that maybe this is my own bias here, but you know, I think maybe even the idea that the state can be playing this role is still a little bit new. And so there might be more thinking to do around where the state wants to plug in and what kinds of actions they want to see communities be taking, and what then it looks like to incentivize those. All right, I'll just say a couple things about, you know, what I'm thinking about as next steps, but then, you know, let's open it up to a conversation. I'm sure you've got ideas too, but you know, when we were doing this, the really clear next step from folks we were working with too is evaluating these policy outcomes and impacts. So we are looking at their presence or absence, but we don't know a lot at this point about how well they're working. And I put here too, I think there's a lot of ways we could think about what that evaluation looks like, linking it to health and housing and the economy in broader ways. I'm part of a workshop right now where we're putting together a panel on flooding and health. And I think there's lots of ways we could think about what kinds of outcomes we want to be seeing from these policies. There were some questions when we were doing this about how aware local governments are of some of these policies, and if there's more work that could be done to raise that awareness. You know, and then I think this third one, you know, what's the potential for transferability or scalability of some of the policies and programs that are at the top of the list, kind of thing. All right, and with that, I'll just say thank you again. A big thank you for the invitation, and looking forward to the conversation as well. And hopefully to staying connected and connecting down the road too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm sure there's a lot to get into. So if anyone wants to come on camera or just raise your hand if you have a question, we can be sure to go through those between myself and Senator Ellman. I'm going to start, just take that point of privilege. But you gave examples for 3 of the category areas. I'm sorry if I missed it, but did you have a favorite funding policy or financing policy that rose to the top in this assessment that you can share?
Yes, so this is a great question. When I was going back through this, I saw that a lot of what came out on the funding side. So one of the ways we looked at funding was how states had allocated things like clean water revolving funds, and this kind of thing. I'm pulling up the sheet here again. And so what I was thinking when I was looking at this is that that was kind of the take home for me, was that it was the states that were building in either like kind of climate resilience and or investment in disadvantaged communities into things like the state revolving fund. Those were the states that that got the highest scores. And so I think states often have, I know sometimes there's some debate, sometimes it's a legislative question and sometimes it's an administrative question about the criteria for allocating those funds. But that high level, that's what we saw, was when like in the formulas that are developed when climate and or disadvantaged communities were built in. That's kind of what we were picking up.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions at the start before I ask more? And then Dr. Hughes, so we talked about this a bit, but can you just share with the group when you stopped your data collection? So kind of as you're going through these, what was your endpoint for the most recent policies?
Yes, my recollection is that we stopped data collection kind of this time of year in 2022. And so I think it was probably maybe more like May 2022. And then, yeah, that's right. And then I think the first report came out that fall, and then the larger journal article came out over the summer.
Got a question. So you evaluated on info and planning and guidance, regulations and standards and funding. Could you give me examples of the planning and guidance models that you recall?
Yes, so the planning guidance sometimes was it would look like here are ways you can I don't know, maybe like a model adaptation plan, or sometimes there would be a risk assessment framework or steps to go through. Let me see if I can pull up. I've got this sort of full sheet here. Let me see if I can pull up a good example. So I've got I think some of it looks like, yes. So I think a lot of this was the state plans that were coming out. So if a state had put together, like in the Minnesota example, and the state had put together a hazard mitigation plan or a climate adaptation or resilience plan, I think a lot of times I think those come with a vision anyway, maybe for where local governments plug in, and maybe provides a framework for the local governments to work within.
Do any, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask another question. Do any of those states like use data to project, where those, because when you're investing in infrastructure and, a lot of this is long-term projects that will last, some of our infrastructure is 70, 100 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of data are used to project that, that effect? You've had that Michigan one of here's what the climate might look like, depending on the scenario. But how do we make sure, or how do we help make sure that those investments are adequate?
Yes, it's a great question. I think there's not yet, I wouldn't say a sort of recipe or playbook yet for doing this. I think a lot of times groups like, I think this is a role that GLLC, a group like GLLC, if not GLLC itself, like that's kind of what they're set up to do, is to be this conduit between climate data and policymakers of all kinds. And I mean, that'd be my recommendation, is to, because I do think even myself, I mean, I'm a social scientist, but even when I try to look for these things, I was doing this for another project around ice levels and projections for future ice levels in the Great Lakes. And it was not as straightforward as I was expecting to get a good sense for where the science was at. And it wasn't, this is maybe too much of a tangent, but it wasn't actually like a big NOAA data set that did it for me either. It was a couple of academic articles that were ultimately the best resource. So I think this, GLLC, they would call it climate services, but this idea of, or this task of doing that translation, I think is still, to me, is still under development. But I think those kind of NOAA centers are good resources. I think universities are good resources for doing this, and setting up those they call them boundary organizations, right? But these kind of places where you don't have to ask a legislator or even an agency person who's got 20 other things they need to do, to figure out how to do this. But I think there's ways to get plugged in. Anyway, all to say though, there's not like this sort of really established clearinghouse or even necessarily methodology for doing this yet.
Go ahead, Charles.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Two questions. First, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Can you please define for us intersectorial? And second question, I understand that you speak about local governments, but when you talk about providing information, is your target also citizens? And how do you manage to reach them? Two and a half questions.
Yeah. That's great. So to me, when I'm thinking about intersectoral, I'm thinking, having to coordinate planning between, say, transportation and land use and stormwater permitting and economic development, right? Or something like this, right? So we've got, these different agencies or departments or kind of areas of work, all of which have some kind of intersection, in this case with flooding. And so I haven't seen many examples where there's a single agency who has the ability to kind of take this on all by themselves. And so a lot of times it looks like a task force or some kind of collaborative mechanism or person who's doing this kind of connecting work. And it's at both the local and the state level and the federal level for that matter, right? But this comes up a lot, I think, with climate risks, just because of how I prefer to say intersectoral than interdisciplinary, and I think that's just because of my own background. Intersectoral makes more sense to me, but kind of same idea probably. Yeah, and with citizens, I think this is a really, really great question. And actually, we're doing some of this, or we're starting a new project in Detroit that's going to be doing some of this work of what does it look like to try to, how do we best engage communities with these questions and develop visions and priorities of the future around these investments too, that are accounting for these perspectives and desires at the community level, in an informed way too. But I don't, I think this is an area I'm still learning about actually. And I will say my collaborator on this Detroit project, Bronco Kirkes in at the University of Michigan, they just developed, I'll give a little plug for Bronco, but they just developed this really cool thing. It's called, it's a video game essentially called something like Storm, how's it called? It's a play on words. It's like Storm City or something like that. But they've taken Detroit's stormwater system and they've gamified it so you can kind of play with different infrastructure arrangements and the storm comes and so I think that kind of thing, I don't imagine there's probably folks who would really rather not log on and play Storm City, but I think those kinds of efforts and along with in-person touch point kind of conversations too. But anyway, it's a new area for me too, but I think really important.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was just thinking one thing, Laura, I'm still thinking about your question too. And as I'm looking, we have a sort of list of what counts under each category. And I might just follow up with that list afterward. That's helpful.
And then
Great.
MPP French, I see you have your hands raised. Oh, sorry, Senator.
Oh, I was going to recognize Jennifer myself.
Thank you. And I didn't mean to jump out of your presentation awkwardly. I had a timed restart I couldn't avoid, and you just all of a sudden disappeared. So I missed what I'm sure were very thoughtful questions after your presentation, but I wanted to add my own quick thoughts. So we had the opportunity as a task force to spend time in Detroit, and Jess would be able to remind, because I can't think of the group that was doing the work on the ground that we spent so much time with and really valued their time and input. Really interesting to be on the bus and travel around and to walk it and see the different emergency interventions, right? And the government had put in those big weird sandworms and all of that kind of stuff, and seeing the aftermath of that intervention. And we talked to people who live there. And I was thinking of them as you were showing the photo and talking about the racial inequity. One of the things that we learned was that if an intervention, whatever level or all levels of government, if one of them was to find appropriate and good, places for people to live elsewhere that were out of the floodplain or flood area, the folks in that community, you have so many generations of harm and distrust and mistrust when it comes to government and different agencies that you can't, we're not getting on a bus that we're not leaving. So you had, which was totally understandable, but a challenge if one of the interventions was not an intervention, but a move folks. Also, insurance was really, I mean, they cannot get insurance. What FEMA covers, if you get FEMA, then you don't get insurance. We heard just folks on their front porch who live out of, the plastic bins, because every time and we were there when the clouds, kind of showed up and we got nervous. I can only imagine them. So we had a sense of the actual feel of it. And so when you're working with people on the ground, the citizens and the neighbors, how much are they a challenge when it comes to buy-in or trust? And I realize I'm going long, but I have lots of thoughts. Sorry. And my colleagues from Quebec could probably speak really in depth about where they have had, I'm going to say success as someone looking in, okay, but massive expropriation, not expropriation, buying people, but we're going to buy your property from you, but we're going to buy it at a fair price, and you have a choice in where you live, and all of them choose to live nowhere near where they can ever be wet again. But again, a massive project that wouldn't have success in some of these areas. So, are you looking to jurisdictions like the folks in Quebec and it's not Santa Ana de Bellevue, but I sort of picture that area, Manel. But anyway, Sarah, all of that I don't know if there's a question there. I have thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think both of those dimensions, this question of buyouts and insurance. I mean, to me, it's sort of, Eastside Community Network. They're a partner on this, on our Detroit project as well.
That's right. And they showed us, I bet it's in Storm City with the infrastructure, like beside businesses where there's the big underground holding tanks that were like swimming pool bladders. I couldn't picture it, but that was a takeaway in terms of interesting infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly where these problems are the most intractable, right? I mean, that's probably almost like the hardest case, is where flood risk is serious and kind of built into the infrastructure. Trust is really low and capacity is really low. I think it's sort of like, this is the hardest case kind of thing, the tough case for this kind of work. And I think I'm coming back to the previous question, actually. I think that's where it'll be most important to be having those conversations and lots of engagement and visibility and transparency and kind of anything in the toolbox to increase participation and trust in any, even if it's even just new investment, too, even if it is an infrastructure upgrade or something like that. I think trust is low, right? I do a lot of work on the drinking water side too, and we just know that the trust in government is just low across the board in a lot of these communities. So I think it just is a tough case and requires special approaches that may not be necessary in communities where conditions are different on those dimensions, where trust is a little bit higher, maybe capacity is a little bit higher. Flood risk is probably sounds like still really built in, baked into the infrastructure, but there's probably not, outside of some kind of strong arm move, there's probably not going to be a way to do that without either. Anyway, my mental model is it's either just strong arm move, which is not probably what anybody wants. Big investment, say, all right, we're smart engineers, we're gonna figure this out. Or big investment in engagement and trust building.
I thought that you made an interesting point kind of at the beginning of your presentation about that, how states and provinces, kind of if we extrapolate, are in the position to provide that equalizing force between communities or different regions and things like that, which I think is a good thing for us to reflect on and think about.
Yeah, and I think, thinking about some of what we were talking about too with the climate hazard projections and best practices around planning and investment. And the sort of nice part is if the state can kind of figure it out, then it's, communities are that much further ahead potentially too. And if we think about, right, I'm from Michigan, but if we think about Detroit having to figure it out as opposed to Ann Arbor having to figure it out, right, those are different jobs. And so if the state can say, all right, we're going to figure it out, not that that's easy either. But anyway, it's an example of what you said, that that at least on the information side or the on that kind of data input side, then you're leveling things out for sure. And probably, anyway, this is going back, it probably looks like I'm thinking about this, who was it? This Pennsylvania's climate impact assessment, right? So Pennsylvania did this climate impact assessment for the whole state, and it ends up with a map of climate risks for the state. and then that can be used if it's at the right spatial resolution. Something like that can be used by everybody.
Yeah, I definitely need to take a look at that. And oh, I'm sorry, Manal, were you going to jump in?
No, it's okay. Today we had a webinar speaking about the social and psychological impact of the flood on people. And it was very interesting because even we had some people who were on the audience, and they were coming from flood zone, and they experienced the two floods, the three big major floods we lived here in Quebec, 2017, 19, 23. So I think that the better way, because even if an administration will prepared, will have the best plans, the best strategies, I think that nature and climate shows us that there is always a surprise. I think that nature only want to surprise us, to surprise a human with things that with situations, with events that we are not prepared for. So I think that the solution is to work with citizens. This is what MPG French was speaking about Quebec. Quebec, we are informing people, we are bombing people with information that be ready, be prepared. There are stuffs that we don't even know what is it. Maybe a tornado, maybe flood, maybe fire. So when we empower our communities, we empower our citizens to be ready, to have the best tools, to be ready to move on, to act. Even also the alert. We have now the alert of like the Amber Alert. We have alert for event, for natural event, so that we can prepare ourselves. And we as a community, I live in a small island, and I'm always prepared. I don't know when I can like just take my bags and go with my children. So I think that as a human being, we have to be prepared for everything. This is also a strategy to add to the preparedness of the government and the cities, to be as a citizen responsible for ourselves, for our situations, for our choice to live in a flood zone or to live in zone of tornado or something like that. And thank you, very beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, great, thank you. I think that all makes a lot of sense. I also just found, I'm going to go ahead, if it's okay, I might just put this in the chat. I found the really detailed version, both of what would get you a certain score in each category, and then why we gave each state the score they got in each category. So let me just post that in the chat. I think that's right. And actually going to this point that is just made, I saw something even just recently in another context or something, I can't remember, but the idea was that local governments are sometimes looking to the state for almost like political cover a little bit, right? Like to the extent that the state's able to provide that, but to say, well, look, the state's saying this is important, we have to get ready for this. So I guess that's kind of the extreme version of it, right? But it's like, we have to plan for climate change, state's telling us to. And that in some cases, I don't think all, of course, but then in some cases, that's something that would be welcome by local governments, right? Yeah.
Well, Dr. Hughes, I know that you said you had an appointment at noon your time. So if you have to drop off, feel free, but we'll continue discussing. But again, thank you so much if you do have to drop off in the interim. And I just wanted to raise, and I don't know if Manel or Charles, if you could add context that Quebec currently has Bill 50 active in the legislature right now, which basically says like, the province has to lead on just emergency response and this disaster response. Each region has to coordinate a plan for both things. And then each locality has to have kind of adopt complementary policies and plans in this area, but also assigns responsibility in response to each level of government as well, which I thought was an interesting model, and not necessarily one we see, but kind of talks about some of the things that Dr. Hughes was raising as kind of who's providing the information, who's providing the direction, and who's responsible. So is that, Bill, something that either of you have worked on or with, or?
Manel, no, I was in a work session earlier this week with a group we were supposed to talk about the new bill that will improve, let's say, this preparedness for the local government, but I'm not very much aware of it. We finally discussed about it was a kind of brainstorming, general brainstorming, very interesting, but I can't answer your question about legislations with accuracy. Maybe Manel is better than me to do that. I don't know, Manel.
Yeah, but this is the law about civil security is being updated with context of climate change, and also I think that the idea is about to have sectors, because the territory is so big. So when we have a big territory, it will be difficult to handle all the aspects of the area. For example, in spring, when we have flood, we have like 1,000-kilometer distances for flood. So the government can afford to help all the municipalities at the same level. So that's why they are like giving a little bit of autonomy for the regions. So every region, every area will have his own adapted plan for emergency. This is why they are like just making a puzzle with many plans of the regions. I hope it's clear.
For our work group session this week, we received each participants received a kind of spreadsheet with the actual law and the one that is being studied, and it's in French. So I'll check if I can find it in the English version, and I'll check also if I can share it with you. But that might be very interesting for you guys. So I'll check that, and I'll get back to you, Jess.
Yes, I get the French unfortunately wouldn't work for me, but yeah,
Yeah.
if they do have an English one, otherwise they did lay it out quite well kind of in their summary and a document. So there was a good amount of information there, but that's definitely something that we will look at moving forward. And Dr. Hughes looks like she did have to sign off. I know she had another meeting. She's offered to continue to work with our group as she switches roles from University of Michigan to the RAND Corporation. And I know that she can provide a lot of assistance to us, definitely looking at the US side and states. Were there any other comments to raise on the presentation or in the issue or in the discussion of flood resilience? And if not, we'll kind of turn to how we reflect on the presentation and how it factors into the policy recommendations that we're working on.
Yeah, does anybody have any comments or potential updates to policy recommendations? Or any new business? We can probably bring this up at our next meeting. I mean, I'm going to try to read that report she was referencing, ranking all of the states.
Yeah.
Commiserating with my fellow Illinoisans. But looking at how other states are doing it, and some of those elements, you know, I think could be helpful in maybe how we frame our policy recommendations too.
Yeah, and Senator, what did you think of that breakdown? So they had kind of, yeah, providing the information, providing this planning guidance, regulation and standards, so more of the kind of like the harder line things, and then funding. In terms of how they separate, or how the study separated out is specific to flood resilience, but to me, those categories might hold true to all of the policies we're talking about, right?
Right. It really could be. And like even the first category, information. Manel, you talked about reaching out, outreach for preparedness, but Dr. Hughes talked about, a map, a climate impact map. So even that information can take different flavors, different types. So yeah, but I think those four kind of vectors could be an interesting way to, when we recommend ours, to talk about those as a kind of a framework.
Right. And I think it's needed. I think we've talked about it, Senator, that like we need to be looking at our recommendations or breaking them down a little bit differently to make them easy for a legislator to kind of grab and implement. So I really did like how they were looking at that. And sorry for chatting. MPP French, go right ahead.
Yeah.
No, you don't need to apologize for chatting. I'm listening and learning. Something, and this is like just thinking out loud. It's not so much a suggestion, but we have a challenge in our province, and if I'm being entirely political, I have one way of saying it. So if I'm trying not to be, then I would say if we have our non-political agencies like the conservation authorities and whoever else, the national parks or like those that may be connected to government, but are measuring things and monitoring things. And I mean, this is back to the blue accounting conversation. We're putting all of this important information in a way that can be utilized and accessed. I would love to see states and jurisdictions, or if it was cities, like I don't care the size of the jurisdiction, like ranked in terms of who's doing the most harm the fastest. So like literally a reverse. And I know that shaming is only so effective, but I do think that monitoring of here's where we were in this year, and not just like who's improving like along these good metrics, like we're ranking them based on these positive things. I'm seeing what I measure as like rampant and enthusiastic harm happening so fast in terms of our provincial contribution to the climate challenges. Anyway, all that to say, if that here's where we started 10 years ago, and here's who has made these improvements, small or big, but also like here's who has lost wetland, here's who has lost this, whatever, or their numbers have changed, or they've withdrawn from this agreement of make the world a better place, like that kind of stuff. Who is monitoring, this, like, I know invasive species ain't our thing, but it's that kind of thing, no matter where you look, when you see that kind of harm, that some of the canary species, like the ones that when we see this, this change in environmental change, then we know that the water quality has disintegrated. Like, anyway, blah, blah, blah. I would love to see rankings that go the other direction. So you can see like, holy crap, this area is the worst. And then that gives us something to point to for the buy-in of community. Anyway, that's just me. Wishful thinking. I don't know about you and your fellow Illinoisans, Laura, but when you talk about the challenges that you all share, I think it probably we've all got challenges in our area in terms of not everyone making the best decisions.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes that is a motivation. Let's move towards the middle.
Well, and
Right.
I know better than to say that, then they should lose funding because that further exacerbates the problem. But I still think that some type of, accountability, but also comparative accountability is there's power in that, right?
And I think, from my standpoint, it kind of lends a sense of urgency. It's like, come on, let's get moving. I might be a little bit competitive. I don't know, with
Unless you
this
look at that and
contest.
you say that's amazing, we're going, like maybe that is the direction they want to go. I don't know, but anyway. I have no more thoughts.
You have no more thoughts?
I have so many more thoughts, but not on this.
Oh,
I will mute myself, but like it was an awkward pause of like waiting for me to
oh.
continue. Yeah.
I was just thinking that type of analysis might be a difficult one from our chair to consider, but more on the side of pointing out the innovative practices on that side. So don't know. But I can look and see if someone else has done one, and then perhaps share that. Um, but yeah, so I think that the interesting thing looking at Dr. Hughes's presentation and then our policy recommendations is how many current proposed bills there are in the states and provinces in these areas that are doing these things that her findings recommend. So when we're talking about Illinois' Drought and Climate Resilience Office that's proposed, or looking at Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Quebec are all proposing interagency groups and task force to work on climate resiliency planning. So it seems like it's something that not everybody has in existence right now, but a lot of states are moving towards that direction. And then also when we're talking about the regulation side, and in our recommendations about, building codes and land use, there's different bills that are in place and proposed that are saying, if you're going to be doing this kind of building on a shoreline, you have to incorporate the agency that's in charge of environment. So it's not just kind of going to be limited to one agency doing these permits, but it's going to be approach that is taking into account the effect on the environment. So I do think we have a lot of already existing policies that we are listing and studying and recommending in our policy recommendations that touch on these things. I think I'm really interested in going through the spreadsheet and identifying where states have done equity and centered equity in these, because I know that's an area that we have highlighted as one of our 4 priority areas, but we haven't necessarily connected existing programs to. So I think that'll be, on my to-do list to take a look at Dr. Hughes's findings and then update what we have in there to call out. And like she said, I would like to learn more about Pennsylvania's mapping. If that's of interest to you all as well, I can try to reach out and dig more into how they did that and what they are able to provide local governments in the Commonwealth.
It would be great.
Go ahead.
Sorry, another thought. We have areas in Ontario that are northern and remote Indigenous communities that have yearly, or if not every year, there's the chance that every year they're going to have the flooding that means the entire community is displaced during the flooding time and back. And I can't speak intelligently about it, but I know that every year it's a government initiative, like they've got to get them out of there. But when they're able to move home, and some of that is nature, and a lot of that could be done differently. But I think it would be interesting, Jess, because I can't speak to it in depth. I just know I follow it kind of on the news. I know that there are communities that still don't have clean drinking water, and there are compounded issues, but the flooding, I mean, this is indigenous land. This is not where they're going to move from. But when you have these big government and community initiatives to temporarily move on a regular basis, you know what I mean, like almost a seasonal basis. I think that there's even something to be learned from that, because it's a large scale evacuation that isn't quite a evacuation like a fire. I've watched it take too long, but it's a process, and it's on a regular basis. And I do think that even looking at some of that would be interesting, because with Indigenous communities, and each is its own, same as when we were talking about Detroit, it was, you know, those like racialized communities, but they were, you know, like low socioeconomic, and, you know, Black Americans with that communities, like that community of harm through the years and experience with government systems that is very, you know, specific to them, but also broadly you can extrapolate. So anyway, I'm thinking, as we're talking about flooding, there's the flooding that happens on a regular basis, like annual flooding. What does that look like, and how could that look? Because I think there's something to be learned from that anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I can look into that and see if there's some information to bring back to the task force. Thank you.
Right. Anything else from any task force members? I see Rep. Troy from Ohio has joined us. Welcome. We didn't catch you when we were doing intros, but glad you were able to join us. And Senator Housley, great to see you. You know what? I think we've gone over a little bit. I think we've had a great discussion, and I think it's time to adjourn. All right.
Well, whatever, as the chair says.
Hold on one second. Before that happens, I see Rep. Troy has unmuted himself.
No, I got on probably a couple minutes after you started, so I caught all of it. I caught the presentation.
Wonderful. Great. Lovely. Well, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Jess, for organizing this. I think it has been a great presentation. And again, it's kind of brought us full circle from our first days in Detroit, visiting those communities with the sandworms. So great to circle back.
Or tiger dams, you know.
Oh, thank you. That's the name.
I think we've renamed them. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I will follow
you.
up with all that information via email and our next meeting in a couple months.
Lovely. Thank you. Great to see everybody.